We'd like to thank the following sponsors for helping provide this video.
Background in software development, consulting, building products, and is also in the process of relocating. So Matt was one of the speakers at our Deep Agile event, and his talks there were very well received, and appreciate and welcome Matt Barcomb.
All right. That was a great introduction. If you want to know more about me, you can probably Google me. I'm not the Matt Barcomb that plays hockey or the photographer in Florida. All right. If for whatever reason in the back you can't hear me, just make the duck face at me, and I'll do something magical. All right. So real quick, so I'm me. I'm Matt Barcomb. You find me here on Twitter. You guys don't have a hashtag, but you have your own Twitter account. So if you want to tweet anything that I'm saying that's either completely asinine or kind of cool, feel free to hit the thing over there. If you have any feedback that you would like to give me anonymously, I use the Say At Me website. So you can do Say At Me, Matt Barcomb, and leave me anonymous feedback about anything, the content, the presentation, the style, my offensive jokes, whatever. Speaking of offensive jokes, how many executives do we have in the room today? Sweet, so I'll try to keep the target there. All right. Oh, by the way, if you couldn't tell, I'm going to say the S word a lot today. Systems. Who here's ever read a book on systems? Systems thinking, systems learning. Who here has like a PhD on systems thinking? Anybody? Because if you do, anybody PhD candidates on systems thinking, those guys are even worse. I will probably offend people who feel very strongly aligned that they know tons and tons about systems, because I'm going to kind of gloss over that. So we'll see how it goes, right? All right, so this talk is meant to be kind of a micro workshop. This was a much larger group than I was expecting. So there's part of this where I would ask you guys to stand up and walk around and do a little dance. We're probably not going to do that because looking at how much you guys all have, that would be a giant cluster. But what I would like you to do is, before we kind of go through some of the examples, and we'll work through some stuff here in small group tables, but on your own, think of an org of interest. How many people here are a consultant or aspiring insultant? Okay, so think of an org that maybe you consult at or something like that, or if you're, who here is who has a real job? Employees. About half and half, that's great. So who's like finding that there's a small line between unemployed and self-employed? Anybody? There are a couple, great. We'll start a bonding group afterwards. So think of an org that you care about. Now think in your mind, I know it's tough, think about a politics score, right? The politics, the backstabbing, who do you gotta know who to get what done? 1 is low, 5 is high. Hold that number in your mind. Think of a red tape score, the bureaucracy. Who do you got to buy a latte to get things done? How many policies stand in your way of doing things that just make sense? 1 is low, 5 is high. Multiply those numbers together. If you need help, ask your neighbor. Okay? What that's going to do is it's going to determine what I call your level of hope. The LOH. All right, you have lots of hope if your answer is between 1 and 4. You've got some hope if your answer is between 6 and 10, and you're in the pray category if your answer is between 12 and 25. So, oh nice, that's right there, I just noticed that. So this is where we would say we would have 4 minutes to get through self-organized groups that are no greater than 6. Instead of getting into groups of 6, because I think that would be awful, take a look around you. Are you guys all pretty much clicked off in, well, let's get through this slide and I'll show you. So what I'd like you guys to do when you work through some examples, if you want to work through examples, I've got slides that step through the things too, but it might be helpful if you guys work through these things with these big flip chart pages. Most tables should have something that look a lot like this, just in case anybody didn't know what a flip chart page looked like. You should also have something that looks like this. I call it a marqueur. It's French for marker. and then you should have 3 different colors of stickies. You don't need a ton. The activity that we're going to go through, that we'll walk you through, we're going to basically do some systems diagramming, which is a cool way of seeing a system. Have you guys all heard the systems thinker proctologist joke? Can I tell the proctologist joke? Yeah, sure. So you've heard like why is a systems thinker like a proctologist? He works with individuals, but he considers the whole. So what we want to do is make sure that we've got a similar hope score. The reason that we're trying to do similar hope scores is because if you're in the pray category, your system of change that's trying to do things with your model might be significantly different from someone that actually has hope. Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing. What you generally find is your big giant corporations, your systems that you're trying to model will look a little bit different. So if you're sitting next to somebody that has a significantly different hope category than you, you might want to turn to your other side or turn to the folks in back of you or something like that. Either way, once you do that, pick one example. If you guys are working groups of 2 or 3, if you're turning around and working groups of 4 or 5, doesn't matter. Pick one example that you're going to kind of work with, whoever's example org that is, and think of some change you're trying to do. Any questions so far? Probably tons, and we'll just do it. So, what do you guys think of this statement? Who thinks modern leaders help facilitate continuous organizational change?
You mean good modern?
Oh, that's great. What do we mean? It's just a statement. I feel that I don't even have a period on there. I mean, what the heck? So think about what I think of as like this is a counter to how many other change initiatives have. So there's a couple things. First of all, right, we used to come from a place where like, if you're in charge, you should take charge, right? Who's in an organization or ever been in an organization where leadership meant take charge, take action, make decisions? These are all good things to some extent, right? Who thinks they like the idea of servant leadership? Who thinks that's a nebulous term that nobody really knows what it means? A couple people. So I like to think of as modern leaders can come from anywhere in the organization at any level. I think that leaders themselves are trying to fill this role as facilitators. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to kind of push and try, because facilitation, who's ever actually tried to facilitate something challenging between like 2 people that aren't getting along? Facilitation isn't just always like, you know, oh, let me go get some stickies for you, right? Sometimes facilitation's, yeah, right? Now here's the other thing, it's continuous organizational change. Do you guys remember the days when like you used to hire in the change team, right? Because change was a big thing that we just had to get through so we could just get to the next plateau, so we don't like change, right? Here's the thing though, right? Change is happening so much between the shrinking of the world, between the travel, communication, just everything's happening so much faster, right? We have to learn how to surf instead of trying to control the waves. We have to stay on top, and it's always happening at every level, so we have to keep inspecting and adapting and changing. So that's kind of what I mean by modern leaders help facilitate continuous organizational change. So I'm going to summarize some things, because I'm going to say there's 2 reasons why change is hard. Who thinks there's only 2 reasons why change is hard? Right? So you might notice this. Who's ever read Switch? I kind of stole this from Switch a little bit. It's a great book. If you don't have it, you should. So one of the reasons change is hard is because what you're supposed to do is not clear. How many people have ever felt like, we're supposed to change, let's be agile? And everyone's like, what? How? What does that even mean? Anybody ever been part of a change initiative like that? Okay, how about this? Why people should change is not very inspiring. Let's be agile so we can make the shareholders richer. Yay, there was much rejoicing. All right. The other reason that I find is that the behaviors or activities that we're trying to change to, or we're trying to change, they're not supported, right? So if I think about what I've seen in many kind of large-scale transformations, we're going to be agile, with capital letters and everything. And so they send all the project managers off to Scrum Camp. Has anybody ever seen that? Okay, so maybe that helps clarify a little bit, 2 days of training somehow. So then they come back from Scrum Camp and they go, okay, we now have a little bit of clarity. Now why are we doing this? Oh, I don't know. But let's think of it. If we took specifically, how often are project managers incented for like on-time, on-budget project delivery? Pretty frequently, see that? Not uncommon. All right, so what are we trying to do? Why are we trying to go Agile? It's not really, we had a little bit of clarity about what Agile is. We're not really sure why we're trying to do it. We say, oh, we want to make our customers happy. We want to go Agile because we want our employees to be more engaged. And we're like, oh, okay, those are all things I can get behind. So now we're slightly inspired to go Agile. But what about this last bullet? What happens if we get some good project managers that are good people, persons, they're caring about their customers, they're caring about all the things we want them to be, but we still say, but at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, if you didn't deliver on time and on budget, you're not getting your bonus, and I'm going to call you a 3 or a 2 or something even worse than a number. How incented do you think that project manager that we now call a Scrum Master is going to be a good servant leader facilitating the change they want?
I give it a 0.
Somewhere, a number very close to 0. Infinitely times smaller than 1. So here's the thing, when we talk about a lot of things that we want to change, we talk a lot about how we want to change the parts of the system. Now, the systems that we're talking about here are people systems, right? So a lot of the parts of the system that we're talking about are individual humans or groups of humans, right? But we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the system as a whole, right? How do we interact with how do the different parts interact with one another? How do the policies or the containers, things that we create, how do those actually interact to create the behaviors we have? You might actually maybe you wouldn't have had to spend all that money sending people off to Scrum Camp. Sorry for people that sell Scrum Camp. If we would have just maybe changed the policy with the incentive program in the first place. Well, what would happen if that happened? And we actually maybe tried something else that we did want to incent to happen. That would be crazy, right? So I think this is why changes are. If you think about most of the change initiatives and the training and the education and even the coaching that we do, it usually focuses on those first 2 bullets, right? How can I make this clear? How can I tell you what to do? I might tell you some principles behind it. How can I motivate you? But how often are we actually thinking about the thing as a whole, whether it's the whole team or the whole department or the whole org or even bigger, right? So that's why I think change is kind of hard. So I think the very first way that modern leaders help facilitate continuous organized change is by seeing what that system is. And that's kind of what this activity is going to take us through. So in order to kind of see what the system is, I'm standing in front of some slides. I think of the 3 major parts of systems are boundaries, parts, and connections. Who's ever heard the term, that's a local optimization? How many people want to punch somebody in the face when they hear that? Has anybody ever thought that someone says local optimization as a call to non-action? We can't just improve the technical practices, that's a local optimization. Or you could just make the tech practices better and see what happens, right? So here's the thing though, you have to consider the boundaries of a system to be able to talk about whatever the whole is. Here's the funny trick though, right? It's boundaries all the way down. It's just like turtles. So one person's local optimization is another person's whole system. So you could say, well, here's this person, I'd like them to change their behavior. You have to consider them in the context of their team. Okay, well, you want to change the team, but you have to change that in the context of their department. Well, I want to change the department, but I have to the context of the organization. How many people think that the boundary of the organization is optimizing the whole company? It's just more systems, right? Because what is that organization a part of? A community, a government, a society, right? It just keeps going and getting bigger. Don't think about it too much, you'll get depressed. So finally then, there's the parts of the system, right? There's the individuals, there's the teams, the departments, there's the parts of the system. If you think about it, you've got a femur and you've got a tibia and a fibia down there and a patella. Those are the parts of your leg. They're joined together through muscles and tendons to create a system that we call the leg, and our legs can do neat things like this. Notice how it didn't come back this way at all? That's because of how they're joined. That's an emergent property of the system I'm going to call leg. And that property emerges because of how those parts are connected, right? So there's kind of neat things about parts and their connections. Is it makes a system, the emergent properties happen in the higher order systems they're a part of. So the thing with, we'll talk a little bit about that more later. So the first thing that we need to do, and this is actually a sanitized example from a real client. So this is real, not just magic speak. The names have been changed to protect the insolent. If you would like to follow along, I'm going to go through my example, and then I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to use your flip chart to try to come up with some examples. So the first thing that we do is we try to talk about the boundaries where we want change to be. So in this case, the first thing we talked about was the dev team. we were talking about some practices specifically that we thought we might want the dev team to take on. This is probably not a big mystery to you. We're probably trying to do things like get coders and testers to work more closely together, or maybe try to do some more change in how they practice their actual coding practices, TDD, CI, stuff like that, paired programming. You can imagine a whole slew of team practices, right? So the next thing that we try to do is think about what was the context of that team operating in. So the hole that was in was kind of this product department. There was lots of things inside the product department, but that was sort of the next level boundary that we wanted to consider. And then finally, there was the whole organization, the company as a whole. This wasn't a huge company, it's kind of a medium-sized company. My rule of thumb is about 3 tiers. So I usually stop at 3 because after we go past the whole org, then we're looking at what's the locality and the municipality, right? And those things definitely might interact at some level. So for example, if you're trying to make a change on the executive team, you might want to consider what's your governmental system, what's your standing in the community, what's like, so it just depends on what you're trying to do. But because we're trying to look at the team, I like my heuristic, my rule of thumb is try to consider 3 tiers of boundaries out and make choices within those boundaries about what you're actually trying to do. It looks really clean, this is going to get kind of messy. So go ahead and take about 90 seconds and try to think about the change that you would like to make in your org, here in your small group, and what are the 3 levels of boundaries for the change that you would like to see happen? 90 seconds.
Specific teams, but not other teams. For example, our IT is going Agile, but the rest of the company, they're not Agile. MIT administration.
And let's see, and outside of that,
the entire institute, not only the administration, and the faculty, staff, and students. You know, and there actually are students there too.
they still have those? How quaint.
And you know, the research.
Boundaries, anybody? Nobody? Who has 3 boundaries? That's good, positive, affirming. Not even close?
No, we just figured out what's
You were supposed to have the talk about beforehand. All right, well, you'll get another 90 seconds pretty quickly in a second, so maybe you can multitask, because that always works out. Yeah. Let's talk about parts of the system next. So, once we have the boundaries of our system, which might look something like this, they might look different. You start adding the parts of the system. So remember, because we're talking about organizations of people, all of our parts are either individuals or groups of individuals. So I choose to break out a specific individual if that person is like, anybody a Wheel of Time fan here? Is that too geeky? I call them like a tavern. Anyway. So there's someone who has an individual has significant impact on the system. A very obvious example might be the CEO, right? The CEO can definitely make or break a company by themselves, right? Yeah. So in this case, I chose to call out Mark, the dev manager specifically, because in this case, Mark had a lot of impact on the team. But here's an example where I just decided to kind of group the devs together. There's a handful of devs, but not that all of them weren't very warm, cuddly, special people by themselves, but in terms of the system that we're trying to model, it didn't make sense to call each of them out specifically because they weren't a significant point on the system. Except for Alice, who was the lead. She was a very opinionated lead, and she was special. Tom, I called out Tom as the BA because he was the only BA on the team, and And then there were testers, who also were about as insignificant as the devs. Just kidding. All right. There were other pieces, though. So Sherry was the CTO. So notice how the CTO and the manager both kind of are straddling a boundary. It's totally fine. There's no wrong way to diagram a system. It's like the 60s. Do what feels good. There's another team. So notice that we were probably talking about maybe working with a pilot team that we didn't name. It's just called Dev Team. But there was another dev team called Team Wombat and another one called Team Xerxes. There was Adam. Adam was the architect. Adam was the architect over all of the teams. There was an ops team in Sherry's organization. There was a PMO. There was Colleen, a very special project manager. There was the executive team, who were not breaking out all of those strong personalities separately. There was a sales department, there was a support department, there was the finance and the HR department. And yeah, all right, so let me go back. Oh, so those were all the parts of the system. Now, you had a great question, which was, where do the customers fall onto this model? So I would probably say they fall outside the red ring because they're not part of the org. For whatever we were modeling at the time, we either, like most orgs, forgot about our customers, or for whatever change we were making, we decided that it maybe wasn't pertinent to the customers. For example, if we were trying to figure out better technical practices, maybe going that many steps outside the system wasn't pertinent for the change. So, but that's a great example of trying to why why 3 tiers of the system is maybe a good heuristic. Because if we were trying to make a product department level change, and maybe we're not talking about our customers, that might be a problem, and we should probably have had another ring. But our smallest ring would have been the department. So if we would have gone 3 rings out, we probably would have included our customer community or something like that. So like I said, this is I'm not trying to model the one right way. This is an example of how to do one version of systems diagramming. There's not a wrong way to do this. So, any questions about what the parts are? There's some people, there's some groups. It's okay to straddle boundaries. All right, so remember this is also an example. There's no way in whatever we have left, 80 minutes total, to do a full-on systems diagram for all of your organizations. So I'm just trying to get you guys to get the gist of this. So pick any organization that one of you guys are at, pick some boundaries, come up with some example parts, and let's just make a diagram as best we can. So, these were the parts. What did we say were the parts of a system? There were 3 parts of a system. Boundaries, parts, connections. All right, so there's lots of things, different ways of labeling the connections of the parts in people systems. And I'm going to only show you a few. There are lots. If you can just make up any kind of connection, you can't get this wrong. The only way you can get this wrong is just by not doing it, all right? So what we chose to do is try to add the connections of decision flow, and we actually wanted to model what was basically the organizational hierarchy. Who here works in a hierarchical organization? Who doesn't? There was a few hands that didn't go up. We're just avoiding exercise. You have a hierarchy of 1. You're the boss.
I am, and the chief final question.
And I like that because then my boss, when he's bad, it's me. So you'll find that while this looks kind of systemy, it's basically just a regular org structure. So you can imagine each of the departments had department heads. They were all part of the executive team. Decisions ran kind of from the executive team to the department heads because they were kind of the same people. And just in case you were wondering, Sherry, the CTO, was actually granted a seat at the executive team, which was kind of helpful. As you can imagine, Sherry had a few direct reports. She had notice the dev managers reported to Sherry. At this level of the diagram already, we haven't done a ton. What do you think is maybe interesting or problematic? Do you have any questions about this diagram yet?
Yes.
What's your question?
So are all the dev managers, how many dev managers are there aside from Mark?
There were 3. So each of the teams that we didn't choose to bubble out, each had their own dev manager. So basically all the dev managers reported to the CTO. Let's keep working through this. The PMO reported to Sherry, so there was probably like a director of the PMO. As you can imagine, Colleen, the project manager, reported into the director of the PMO. Adam, the architect, reported directly to the CTO. Ops reported to finance. Weird, huh? All right. The devs, as you can imagine, reported to their dev manager. If you see what the blue circle is here, if it helps you for visualizing your mind, Both Team Wombat and Team Xerxes had almost their exact same blue circle. I just chose not to expand that out for the context of this diagram. The leads reported to the architect, not to the dev manager. Interesting, the testers and the BAs reported to a project manager, who reported to a PMO. But they're all under Sherry, right? So they're all aligned, no problems there, right?
PMO.
The project management office here. Yeah, not any of those other POs. So already at this point in the diagram, we haven't diagrammed much out except the parts and one level of connection. What problems do you think might exist in this organization?
Sherry.
Sherry's a problem?
Could be.
Bottlenecks, gatekeepers.
Direction? How would you, on a scale of 1 low, 5 high, in terms of decision making, how would you rate this company? 5 is high, they're really good at it? Or 5 is really, sorry, low, bad, yeah, okay. Yeah, probably 1. There was some interesting stuff. I mean, they actually, got some stuff done, but yeah, there was probably, I look at this diagram and think, man, I bet there's architectural initiatives that the leads have to go do, and they're on the team. Are those architectural initiatives aligned with the product strategy? Probably not. Hopefully that'd be cool. What about ops? How do we actually get things deployed, right? If your code deploys in a forest, but you didn't have an ops engineer, did it really happen? What happens there? Well, we'll see. We'll see how this goes. All right, so what I'd like you guys to do, if my slides have ever changed. Oh, wait, sorry. Second level of connections. So the next thing we added was workflow connections. So we had hierarchy, reporting structure, and these dotted lines here, I don't know if you can see them, they're kind of this blue dotted line, was how actual work units flowed between different parts of this system. So basically what happened here was HR had to directly report to the executive team for whatever they considered their legal or policy reasons. But in practicality, finance controlled HR because it was just looked at as an admin function in this particular company. I'm sure that never happens. All right, so HR, as you can imagine, workflowed downstream to the development managers. I only drew the dotted line to Mark, not to each of the teams to keep the diagram uncluttered, but that kind of makes sense, right? Things like performance evaluations, stuff like that. Mark had to do that. Interacted workflowed back and forth between the HR department and the dev managers. The devs, as you can imagine, workflowed back and forth between the devs, the dev lead, the BAs, the testers. This is pretty normal, hopefully, in a mostly functioning team. Oddly enough, the testers and the BAs actually spoke. Not a bad thing, so maybe we're somehow hobbling by. Oddly enough, the devs and the ops people actually worked together because they had to deploy things every now and again. The architect was also a bit of a seagull, so this wasn't necessarily a specific thing that he was trying to do, but all the devs basically said that every now and again Adam would come by and do that little, hey, you got time for this, right? I'll get you a latte. All right, here's something kind of interesting. The dev managers and the project managers all had workflow back and forth. So this is probably things like status reports and metrics gatherings and all sorts of that business, right? Whoa, what's happening here? Sales and support, workflows from sales and support into the project management office? Man, maybe that's what Colleen is taking to talk to the, okay, we'll see how that goes. All right, what are you doing? Okay, so finally, relationships. So what relationships meant in this context was sort of something a little bit more personal. Where people kind of had friends. So you can almost think of this as the influence network of the system. So in this context, there were some devs and testers that were actually friends. I know that's crazy. It's crazy, but it actually happened here. They'd go play Magic the Gathering together. The testers, some of the testers actually came from support departments. Who's ever seen that? So a lot of them had friends back in the support department. The devs actually were friends with other devs on other teams. You can make sense out of that. Mark actually had some connections, mostly with the managers in ops as well. So they had some friendships there. Probably needed to get things done, given that op actually reported to finance. There were some people between the sales and the PMO that had a personal relationship. Friends, probably played softball together, went golfing or something. Oh, I did again. I wish there would signal when I'm at the end of my builds, right? All right, So I think this is mostly it. So does this kind of make sense? It's getting pretty messy, right? And this is it. This is only 3 kinds of connections. Can anybody else imagine other kinds of connections that might exist between other parts of the system? I'm not going to ask you what it is. Raise your hand if you can imagine other kinds of connections. Right, so these are people. These are human systems. We are messy, messy creatures, right? We're actually, in some ways, messier than gerbils. And I'm not even done. These are just the connections. We're going to have to do some other stuff to this later. So if you look at what we're seeing even so far in this diagram, what problems might we have? What's that? Communication, sure. Right, yeah. What should we work on? Who thinks this team, this organization might have a multitasking problem? Who thinks this organization might have too much work in progress? Who thinks this organization leaves enough time for testing? Oh, yeah. Very hopeful. Who thinks they get everything deployed when they would like it to be deployed? One person, very hopeful back there. Yep. Yeah, what's your question?
Okay. So this is your assessment of the organization. The organization is hierarchical. Is that correct?
We got the hierarchy. So the question was, this was my assessment, but in reality isn't the organization hierarchical. So actually, this wasn't my own assessment of the system. This was actually a workshop that I facilitated for, I think it was like mid-level managers. And I asked them all these questions. So they did what you're doing, and they built this system. I drew it all up on a whiteboard and used stickies, but this was their interpretation of their own organization. I would guess there's probably more pink lines, but I don't think the organization had established the level of safety to talk about some of the other kinds of connections and relationships in the system. But as you can see, like the black lines are the hierarchy. The black lines are effectively the reporting structure. But the dotted blue lines is how work actually flowed, because not all work flowed up and down the hierarchy. And then, I mean, you can almost think of as the pink lines, I call them the latte lines. Like, who did you know that you could give a latte to just get some stuff done? You can imagine, right? How often do you think Mark went over to his buddy in ops and was like, man, we got to release this by Friday. Well, I'll buy you some beer if you push the magic deploy button. How often do you think the sales guys went to their buddy up in PMO and was like, oh, we really need to get this thing sold so we can make our numbers this quarter. Can't you just put this in the roadmap? Can't you make a roadmap? Can I sell your roadmap? So there's all sorts of connections in the systems, yeah.
So I just have a question. In a company that's sort of trying to do things in an agile way, like, how do you fit into this? Oh, sorry. How do you fit into this? People who meet. So in other words, you've got, you have stakeholder meetings where you have people from different departments meeting together to review priorities and make some decisions together. So, it isn't just things flowing in one direction or, from this to this to that.
There's a reason they called me.
What?
There was a reason they called me.
Right, but let's say you've got, if you've got an organization that's sort of doing that well in some ways and maybe not in every way, whatever, how do you put that in the diagram? I don't see it reflected by anything.
You can choose to just make another connection. I mean, so I tried to model through a workflow, and so maybe it was not fair to call the hierarchy decisions, so maybe if you have like a lot of consensus type decisions or groups that get together, maybe that would be a purple sparkly line. I mean, you can have as many connections as you want that make sense to model systems. The purpose of systems diagramming, in the context of some change you're trying to see, is to understand the system as a whole, right? So if we were trying to say, well, what we need to do is, what would be something that you want to try to get changing kind of across departments? We want to unsilo testers. Well, maybe we see that that's not maybe a huge problem, but maybe we see that, well, we're probably matrix managed here, right? What if our change is not in alignment with all of the various functional managers that matrix this team up? I mean, the purpose of a systems diagram is to just help us see the whole. It's not going to help us do a thing, but we have to know what kind of mess that we're getting into. So if there's other kinds of connections that make sense for your context, you should totally add them to the diagram. If there's meetings, if there's groups in here, and
how
maybe,
would you do that? In other words, it's not a boundary, it's not a line,
is it another part? Is it a decision-making part?
It's a bunch of different you know, it's heads of different departments meeting together to make decisions together.
So in one way, you could say, oh, you guys can't see that screen. You could say the executive team is like that, right? So if it helped, if there was like a virtual team or a decision-making team or a group of people that got together, I'll just throw another sticky on there. It's another part of the system. It's this group that makes decisions about these things.
Well, I'm thinking about, you know, for example, like a stakeholder meeting that has people from different departments to make decisions about what's going to be done next.
What do you call that group? What would you call that?
It was the stakeholder meeting.
Okay, so put it on a sticky, the stakeholder meeting group, and boom, there's another part of the system.
But it crosses all the it crosses the
Well,
boundaries.
is it in a team, or is it in?
No.
Then it's part of the whole org, right?
It's part of the whole org.
Yeah, and if your change was maybe further outside of the team, you might not even have the team circle there. Like if you're trying to change things that like a cross-departmental change, and that group was key in helping that happen, I probably wouldn't have even drawn the team. I would have just had a couple of stickies that was like, there's the dev team over there, and that it would have been its own sticky, not its boundary, right? So you have to think about the context of the system and the context of the change you're trying to make. Like I said, because otherwise the problem with systems, and I love systems theory, but all of the books that I've read, like they don't help you. I've not seen a ton of systems books that help you go do something with it. So systems diagramming is one way of helping you actually see the system that you're trying to tackle. But you can't model the whole, so you could, but you're going to have a really big diagram that it's going to be too much. Does that kind of make sense? A little bit? We can follow after this too. All right, so 90 more seconds. Think about the connections between the parts in your org. They can be whatever you want, but just as a reminder, I labeled decisions, workflow, and relationships. So if you've got your stickies on there, you can use the markers to just draw lines between the parts.
But actually, 3 levels. It's the individual people who have different roles. And then organizationally, HR is a collection of stovepipes. Okay? And then the actual work that needs to be done by the overall organization in terms of their work is above ground, below ground, or emergencies. You've got the executives and the other interesting fact in the utility companies, they have this regulatory spend. They are required to spend their entire budget, otherwise their rates go down. So it's okay sometimes for them to snowplow work and not get things done, as long as they spend the right amount. So, which, you know, creates dysfunction in its own way. So now, if you try to look at that this way, so the CEO would have had control of the exec team and the spend team and the ground, and I hate crossing lines.
What if you put an arrowhead on it to indicate who's controlling who?
Controlling this. Okay, in that case, what I'll do is I'll take this off and I'll get these going right here, right? The exec team basically is the one that does this, and that's there.
It would be really frustrating if I saw time now.
I was thinking of those independent of each other.
That would be great. All right, guys, that was 90 seconds. I know, not quite enough time. So just to give you guys an example of how this usually works, I might grab some type of a leadership team of maybe about half a dozen, give or take a few. And it probably takes anywhere from a half a day to a day to do this activity with those people.
More than 90 seconds?
I know, it's crazy to think you can, like, but time boxes actually help them too. I do use slightly larger time boxes. Yeah.
Do you do any interviews inside before that?
Yes, absolutely. I would never come in completely cold-cocked and do just this.
Glad to hear you
I
say
like to find my minds before I go to the minefield. There might even be some organizations that I'm like, I'm just not going to work for you. Sorry. Call these other people. They have way more tolerance for that kind of crap. All right, so kind of moving along, building into the systems diagram. Modern leaders help facilitate continuous organizational change by seeing the system and understanding its influences. Influences of a system are a lot like the connections for people systems, right? So there can be any kind of influences that you think make sense. So again, I'm going to go through just a couple that I walked through with this organization. There's no wrong influences. Just get it onto the diagram, all right? So back to our, so who has heard of a gal named Glenda Eoyang? I'm probably screwing her last name up. She's an amazing lady, does a lot of complex adaptive system stuff. So I pretty much exactly stole this from her book called Facilitating Organization Change. It's a great book. It's probably one of the most practical books on applying complexity theory to organizations that I can think of. I like it a lot. So her model is this, it's called the CDE model, Containers, Differences, and Exchanges. So we're gonna go through these different things as types of influence in our systems diagram that we're building. All right, so this looks familiar, right? We're going to start talking about what we thought the important differences were between some of the groups and people of the system. All right, so most of the testers in this organization were non-technical. Not a big surprise. That was something that they thought was going to be a significant difference. A lot of the operations people were foreign contractors. So the reason they thought that was important was because of some of the cultural differences. And because that they felt that the contract nature of the ops department, maybe they didn't feel like they had skin in the game, or one of those awful sports metaphors that I don't know about because I don't play sports. There was one team that was really only back-end focused, back-end skilled. There was a gender discrepancy that they felt was different in the PMO. Maybe I'll cover this one a little bit. There was a lot of females in the PMO, and there had been complaints both ways between the dev teams and the PMOs about, what's the word I'm looking for? Not sexual attention, the other thing. Harassment? Yes, that one. So that seemed to be something that they felt was something that was, sorry? Style? Oh, right, sorry, was it harassment? That people were thinking that some people didn't know how to do their jobs or were doing their jobs too much or things like that. This was specifically brought out. So as you can see here though, like there's a couple of different kinds of differences that were called out here. Some are very obvious physical differences such as gender or foreign culture. Some of them were more about educational differences, like the testers weren't educated in technical skills, they were educated in other things. And then some were either maybe skill-based or interest differences, such as back-end programming versus front-end programming. All right, the support workers were shift workers. Shift happens, but only with the support guys. All right, so those were the only important differences that this team decided were there. They actually didn't think that there was a bunch of other differences that were significant. So you can probably think of lots of kinds of differences. The important thing is to find the ones that are important. And differences can be significant in good ways or bad ways, right? So the cool thing about differences is it's another word for diversity. So depending on how we harness diversity, it can either amplify something we're trying to do because we're getting more creative and more ideas, or it can damp what we're trying to do and actually have negative effects. So differences aren't bad, they just are. We need to figure out whether or not they're causing a problem, in which case we want to damp the difference, or maybe it's something that we want to amplify, depending on what we're trying to do. All right, so 90 more seconds. Label with a different colored sticky, perhaps. Whatever you think the significant differences are in your system. It can be physical differences.
Here is the project team. Okay. So the project team was composed. The project team is composed of all of these people, each of whom has accountability for a different part of human resources, and also has 3 competing projects.
Yeah, that tech services.
So I guess tech service had less of a product or orientation. It wasn't responsible for functionality. It was an enabler of the functionality that other groups produced. More like consultants or what? What do they do? More like, for example, writing utility programs that could be called by programs, you know. The SAP system lived on top of Unix, and for a number of things you could just call on SAP functionality for
Get these people all to work with resources.
So I'm going to rip through the next kinds of influences. We can add to them as we go along, but I want to make sure that we get through most of the content. So the next thing we labeled was containers. Now what containers are, they can be either physical containers, like in this case most of the dev teams worked in a collaborative space, kind of some open space bullpens. Most of the rest of the company worked in cube farms, but why they called these two out specifically was because you would oftentimes find that support folks wanted to come and work with devs, or sometimes devs or testers would actually go and try to reduplicate stuff with support people. But because of the two different spaces, there were actually complaints about like, well, I don't want to go work in the dang cubes, because the devs and testers like their open space, and actually the support folks, they hated it. They were like, I don't want to go work in their collaborative space. I mean, it's all big and open, and I feel like scared, like a scared rabbit. But they don't have to be just physical containers. They can be policies, right? So in this case, there was some significant policy containers here. Devs were allowed to work from home. However, all of the product management office people had an in-office requirement. They had to be there, no matter what. Do you think that ever caused contention? There was another policy change between finance and HR that they needed to stack rank people, because that always works out well. What's that? Stack ranking. Assigning you a number to your humanness. All right. There was a cultural container, this idea that persisted that QA was the last line of defense. Anybody ever heard that before? Man, it's a great fiction. All right. There was some other things about in terms of kind of, I wouldn't say that these were organizational goals, but these were kind of like team goals, things that were driving people. These were also containers, right? So devs wanted to ship stuff, but ops wanted to keep things stable. I'm sure you've never heard that story. While the leads and the architects were, you know, up in their ivory tower trying to decide the future of the design. It must scale to all the things ever, right? A couple of other things were organizational objectives, right? So the support department, they were incented to close tickets quickly, very fast. So that never caused any problems. The sales guys, coin operated, right? They did revenue and commission. The HR department, they had to hire quickly. They had to fill the spots, otherwise they were slackers not doing their jobs. Oh, the executive team. Their board of directors held them accountable for profit margins every quarter, which isn't bad. We need to make money, but you know, we've got to be careful about how we do it. And the finance department, the CFO, as many finance departments are interested in, we're trying to always reduce costs. Reduce cost, increase profit, stack rank our people, live in a cube farm, close the tickets fast. Anybody ever been to a place like that? Yeah. No? Only a couple of you guys. Man, the rest of you guys are really lucky. All right. We're going to skip this one. The next set of influences, we talked about consequences. Now I want to talk about consequences because I'm not using it in its typical kind of negative colloquial sense. It's just you take an action over here and ripples happen, right? So there's stuff that happens in human organizations. Some of it we want to happen, some of it we don't know, right? So there were some consequences, right? So the sales department felt that actions were being taken in the organization that meant that they were having to deal with complaints of low quality from customers. Never saw that one coming. Oh my lord. The support department felt that other people were doing things that made them have to reopen cases that they'd already closed out because they were incented to close them quickly. Man, can you imagine that the PMO, the project managers, were complaining about all this unplanned work they got? Who's surprised by that one? Anybody? Any surprised? No surprise face. All right. Weird. The dev teams felt that there was a lack of direction. I'm lost in the desert. Horse with no name. The ops people felt they were just getting a ton of extra work that they didn't really need to do if people just did their jobs and were accountable and cared about the systems as much as they did. Who thinks this sounds familiar? Whose reality is this? This was a very archetypal plan. Now this is probably the most bothersome part of the slide. The executive team felt that there was not a lot of clarity. Holy crap. If anybody should have clarity in the company. Anyways. Yes?
Did all this come from your work with the executives? I mean, the executives said that the dev team felt they lacked direction.
So this came from a few different interviews. So we would take a couple passes through parts of this diagram, and we'd make kind of an amalgamation at the end. So at the end, though, this diagram, as it mostly is now, with the names a little bit different, and actually there was more on it. I had to clean it up for a presentation so you can see stuff, and it's already messy. This was public. The entire company saw this.
But the was, for example, the PMO who said that there was unplanned work for PMO, and the ops who said there was extra work for ops.
So this wasn't an executive team. There were senior leaders from almost all of the areas, and some of this was anecdotal, probably. So I don't think that there was, for example, a sales rep that was part of making this diagram. So you'll notice that there actually isn't a ton of work associated with sales, but folks did know like how they were incented. So I did ask things like, well, what are the organizational goals of the other departments and things like that. So yeah, I'm trying to make sure that we're understanding the influences as broadly as we can. But again, once this was done, we did expose it to sunlight, and the sales guys could.
It went off.
I don't know what happened. Is it back
I think
on?
you hit the, yeah.
All right. Everybody saw it. So everybody had their opportunity to weigh in, to make changes, to disagree. At the end of the day, there's no wrong way to do these. I think the whole idea is to help just see more of what happens, because this is something that they did before they went to go meddle with things. Does that kind of make sense?
And were there many changes that the organization made to this diagram after they saw it?
Made to this diagram?
Yeah.
So I like to think, well, actually, I think all diagrams are kind of living diagrams. So what wound up happening, like I said, this was actually much messier once we finished it. And we started talking about the kinds of changes that we wanted to make organizationally. And then we kind of said, well, which in this context is going to be both what's going to be easy versus hard, and what's going to be impactful versus less impactful. So we kind of use those two scales to decide what types of change initiatives that we wanted to do. But there were things in here like, I can't remember the exact context, but obviously, as you can see, there was problems with getting things deployed on time. However, when they looked at this, they decided that maybe trying to reorg such that the ops people actually reported to the CTO, and we were creating more of an alignment between dev and ops, maybe that would be better than what they thought the problem was, which was scope creep. So they decided to ignore some of the scope creep changes for now and try to do something that would make more of a pipeline of deployment. I don't know if that was the right call or not, but the idea is that before you start poking at stuff, you should probably see the tapestry before you pull on a thread. All right. Any other questions about consequences? Oh, there was a high exit rate. Yeah.
How were these issues resolved? Was it through policies, or?
Let's talk about that. I have lots more slides on that. Is that okay? Yeah.
Is the consequences layer where you take a look at how people are incentivized, both formally and what motivates them informally?
There might have been a little bit over that. This was more like, maybe consequence is the wrong word, but impacts might be another. So most of the orange bubbles were things like that, were the policies that created the impact. So like, we shape the thing over here and stuff falls out. The stuff that falls out, those are mostly the red bubbles. So, kind of make sense? All right, we're gonna skip this too because we're like almost out of time. All right, so why change hard part 2? Boom. I'm gonna say some stuff that I hope makes sense because I'm gonna go through it a bit quickly. People systems, which is our organizations, are made up of parts that are continuously, contextually variable. That means we're messy people. Who here is in a relationship of any kind? Is it kind of weird sometimes?
Oh, yeah.
Or is it just straightforward? You wake up, you know exactly what's going to, and we have kids. Tell me that is not continuously contextually variable. Who here has a significant other? Continuously contextually variable. My wife complains about that all the time, and she's very right to do so. People systems are made up of parts that are, and this is important, simultaneously parts of other systems. Who here has a job? Keep your hand up if you also have a family. Keep your hand up if you have any hobby at all that involves another human. All of you people with your hands still up are part of at least 3 systems, and you're never not part of any of them. Does anybody associate strongly with their gender, with their culture, with their job, with their community, with their profession? You guys are all here, you're part of this system, the Agile New England system. So this is very important, because when you're shaking the system, even that systems diagram that we have isn't complete, because every person in that system, you have to overlay all of these bubbles and things, right? So these are very, very messy things. But what that means is when you change people systems, it will. And I'm not a very black and white guy. I love gray, 50 shades of them. It will create unintended outcomes. Now that doesn't mean they're bad, but there will be unintended outcomes when you change people systems. It is inevitable. It will happen. The other thing it means is that all, underline all, of the outcomes from a change to a people system are impossible to predict. You cannot predict all of the changes that will happen when you change one thing over here with a people system. You can't even do it very easily when the people system is 2 people in a committed relationship, trust me. Unintended consequences will happen. So when they're bad, they will happen. And it's impossible to know them beforehand. This makes people systems something that we call complex adaptive systems. We call them that because the individual parts of the system have choice, and the system as a whole also acts as if it has choice. There's a dude named Akoff that writes about the 4 kinds of systems. That's one of them. He's a brilliant dude. Read everything you can by him ever, then chew it up and eat it and digest everything he's ever written. All right, so modern leaders embrace uncertainty by designing experiments. Okay, a little over, I want to rip through this. Experiments start with an informed hypothesis. Any scientists here? A couple. So, informed hypothesis. This is really, really important, especially with people systems, because when Newton said, I think there's gravity because I saw an apple fall, that's not a people system. He saw an actual apple fall, right? If you're saying something like, well, I think my hypothesis is we could ship in 2 weeks instead of 3 months. Are you the only person that thinks that? So make sure that you have an informed hypothesis, some type of data or evidence that makes you realize your hypothesis is actually kind of valid, all right? Think of some informed hypothesis, right? This is probably any change initiative that you want to do ever, right? It should be a hypothesis. Think of it as a hypothesis. When you do an organizational experiment, consider simplification first. How many people's hypothesis that you're holding in your mind had to do with removing something from the system? Who here has ever been part of an organization that had a performance review system and policy? Who thought it was very fair and equitable and perfect and it was great? A couple people, very rare. So what would happen? It's a problem. I would think most people would agree that it's a problem. The performance management system is a problem. Who would agree with that statement? What if we just got rid of it? Well, there's other questions that would bring up. Well, how do we give people feedback and da-da-da, but you know. But what if we just got rid of it? It's an experiment. So we have a hypothesis, we have a problem that management was doing the same, but what if we simplified first? What if we got rid of the thing that we knew was causing a problem? Instead of trying to change it or come up with a better one, just get rid of it first, then see what problems emerge from our people system, and then react to those things. Inspect, adapt, continuous organizational change. Yeah?
What if HR won't let you do that?
Right. Then you hide like a dime bag of Coke in their lap desk and call the cops. You're like, dude, that guy was the HR director. I can't even believe that. No, don't do that. I'm not encouraging that at all. But the idea here is that you should try simplifying things first. What policy can we remove? What process can we take away? Is there something that we can reduce before we add or change, right? So we don't end up with this pickup sticks haystack full of policies that we have to navigate, all right? So think of something that maybe you could remove from your system that would help enable your experiment, that would help enable your hypothesis. And finally, in people systems, and quite frankly all experiments, they have to be actionable and sensible. So this means able to be sensed, not sensible like common sense, although they should be that too. So actionable obviously means there needs to be things you can do. Otherwise, it doesn't matter, right? It's just an idea. So what makes it an experiment is you can do something and test something with it, right? Now here's the trick though. It's not like, well, I saw an apple fall from the tree, so I'm going to drop something and see if it falls. Oh, look, it fell. That's a very easy to sense experiment because it's with a physical system. It's tangible. You have to find some way of sensing the change that you're making in your people system. Sometimes this can be obvious. We're going to have people pair using the new spooning technique. And people said they hate that because, well, when they spooned, it was really awkward and HR got involved and it was not pretty. So we're not going to do that one anymore. That's probably a good thing, although there's a great video on spooning on the internet. So, but there could be more subtle changes. What happens if you do remove a policy like the performance management system? After the shouts of joy go up, how are you going to know if it's working? Are people getting the feedback they need still? I mean, you don't need a performance management system to give people good feedback. You just need good managers. But how do you have good managers? How do you know? So one way to think about how to sense change in a people system is by stories. We're humans. We love telling stories. What stories might you hear around the office? What stories might you hear at the water cooler? Both good and bad. If things are going well and if things are not going well. So you might jot a couple of those ideas down. What types of things would you see? Have you guys ever seen like those empathy maps for like some of the lean startup stuff? Like what would the customer see, think, feel? You can almost use an empathy map to diagram out your human organizational change. What types of things would you see? What behaviors, what actions, what outcomes? What would you hear? What were the stories in the hallways? What types of other outcomes might you see if your experiment was having its intended or unintended outcomes? Both of those are important, remember. All right, so think about an experiment that you could do, something that you could take on in the near future, either by yourself or with some help, that's both something actionable and have some idea about how would you sense it in your organization, and make sure that it comes from an informed hypothesis. And my suggestion would be consider simplicity before addition. All right, so what we basically went through today, this is all of it in summary. Modern leaders help facilitate continuous organizational change by seeing the system and understanding its influences, and modern leaders embrace uncertainty by designing experiments. These are the, a lot of books that went into this talk, but these are the 6 that I referenced. Fifth Discipline is great if you haven't read it. It actually does some different kinds of systems diagramming. It talks about amplification and damping. I mentioned facilitating organization change. That's got the containers, differences, and exchanges model. Switch is a great book about change in general. Talks about clarification, motivation. All these are great books. Anti-Fragile System talks about simplification, more about Argyris. Anyways, if you have any questions, I know we're over time by a good bit, 10 minutes. I'm going to hang around for a while. So, that's it. Thank you, man.
We've actually got a few minutes for questions.
Oh,
can you hear? Any questions? Okay. Speak up. Stand up and speak.
I'm sorry? Yeah. Isn't all of it? Yeah. I mean, Scrum is this too, right? Like, Scrum, what does Scrum tell you to do, right? There's some rules, there's some rituals, but like, would you go and implement Scrum if you've got most of your problems between sales and product management? Maybe you need to change how the sales guys are incentivized.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Okay. Yeah.
What's that last book? I can't read it.
It's called Anti-Fragile. It's by Taleb. He also wrote The Black Swan, which is another great book, but you can only fit so many books on a slide.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. We appreciate it.
Thanks.